Hey guys, today we're going to be looking at the rise of Greek philosophy. This is a process that started back around 600 BC and that continued up throughout the entire classical period of ancient Greece. And it would go on to inspire thinkers for the millennia to come and is still inspiring scientists and philosophers today. So it's a very important topic. Here are your video goals. You should be able to explain what kinds of questions philosophers ask, how they seek to answer these questions, and why philosophy developed in a democratic society. And you should be able to talk a little bit about the main ideas of those philosophers listed below. Let's start by talking about what philosophy is. So philosophy in Greek literally means the love of wisdom. Philo meaning love, and Sophia meaning wisdom. And so what philosophy is all about is the attempt to gain knowledge about the world using logic and observation. Logic is basically using reason to reach a conclusion. So based on what you know, using reason to put everything you know together to reach some kind of outcome. Mathematics, for example, is a kind of logic. Observation is just observing the real world, taking note of certain details and then using those details to support your arguments. So using logic and observation, you need to use those two things in order to understand the world. Philosophy is just as much about what you don't allow to influence your beliefs. And so philosophy refuses to allow tradition or mythology to explain the world. You're only allowed to use logic and observation. All the other stuff, tradition, myth, gut feeling, is left out. And philosophers usually seek to know the answers to the most profound questions that we know how to ask. And the three main types of questions that philosophers ask can be broken down into three categories: metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. Metaphysics asks, what is the nature of reality? Where did everything come from? What is stuff made out of? Epistemology asks, what is truth and how can we know stuff? How do we know the world? And ethics asks, what is right, what is wrong, and how should we live our lives? It's important to note that the first philosophers were also the first scientists. Up until around the 1700s, there was no difference between being a scientist and being a philosopher. They were one and the same thing. So before we go on to look at the first philosophers, an important question to ask is, why ancient Greece? Why did philosophy start here? Well, one important thing to think about is that democracy, which was a governmental form not just in Athens but in other city-states as well, was founded on the idea of argumentation, that different people needed to present their ideas and then we would pick whichever one was best. And logic was a crucial part of effective rhetoric. So anybody who tried to convince crowds of what to do needed to use logic to convince them. And logic, as you remember, is one of the major parts of philosophy. Also, another thing that helped to lead the Greeks to philosophy was trade. Trade leads to the exposure of many new ideas. For example, they inherit Egyptian mathematics, Persian astronomy, and the Phoenician alphabet. Also, they encounter all the mythologies of these different places, and it leads some Greeks to start to wonder about mythology and whether mythology is a good way of understanding the world. One famous Greek philosopher put it this way. He said, well, he noticed that every religion basically made Egyptians or Phoenicians or Persians seem to be the best depending on where you were. And so he pointed out that if cattle and horses or lions had hands and were able to draw with their feet and produce the works which men do, horses would draw the forms of gods like horses and cattle like cattle, and they would make the gods' bodies the same shape as their own. And so what Xenophanes is getting at there is that it seems like everybody just makes up stories about themselves and then pretends that it's telling them about the real world. And some Greeks started to doubt this and to try and look for better answers than the answers provided by mythology. So the first Greek philosophers were a group of dudes known as the PHYSOLOGOI. And what does that mean? Well, PHYSOLOGOI means those who study the physical world. And basically, what they try to do is they try to figure out what the world is actually made of and where the world comes from. This is a question of metaphysics, and these guys are concerned mostly with metaphysical questions. They were helped by their knowledge of Egyptian math and Persian astronomy, and they are kind of the first people to really set about questioning the world in this way, in a rational, scientific, and materialistic way. The very first guy, who gets credit anyway, is a guy named Thales, who started philosophizing around 600 BC. And he's not a very impressive figure compared to the people who come after, but he is kind of the first. And so he argued that everything in the world was made of water, and he was able to learn how to predict solar eclipses, which impressed a lot of people. And he's also famous for bringing back geometry from Egypt. Another PHYSOLOGOI is Anaximander, and he comes up with the very influential idea that everything is made out of different elements, and he comes up with the idea of the four elements: earth, fire, water, and air. He also claimed that the sun was 27 times larger than Earth. Not quite right, but he's on the right track. And he came up with a sort of basic idea of evolution, arguing that human beings came from fish. So these are the PHYSOLOGOI, and they're the first people to really start thinking about the world in terms of stuff and using logic to try and figure out how exactly that stuff worked. Some other early philosophers who are worth knowing about were also mostly concerned with metaphysics. One of these guys is Pythagoras, and you guys already know Pythagoras from your geometry classes. And Pythagoras was famous for believing that everything in the world was actually number. And so the idea was that even though things look like they're made out of stuff, really mathematics is the truth behind it. And that's why math is able to explain the world, because everything at its root is made up of number. And he's famous for uncovering a number of geometrical ideas, including the Pythagorean theorem, which you all know. Another guy was a dude named Heraclitus, and he said actually nothing is anything. Everything that exists is always becoming something else. So you're never actually anything, but you're always becoming something else. And he summed up this idea by saying that you never step in the same river twice. So even if you step in a river and step out of it and step back in again, you're standing in something different than you were just a second ago. So nothing is, everything is becoming. And then last, and maybe most impressively, were the dudes called the atomists. And they argued that everything in the world is made up of atoms moving through empty space. And this is interesting because they seem like they're kind of right. Of course, modern physics would say that it's more complicated than that, but the atomists were on the right track. They had the idea of the atom, which was a piece of matter that you could not cut anymore, that it was as tiny as you could get. And they said that everything that happened in the world could be explained in terms of atoms moving around and combining with each other, that we were atoms, that trees were atoms, that the planet was atoms. And they were also some of the first atheists in history. They said there was no such thing as a soul, there were no gods, and there was no purpose. Everything was simply atoms randomly bumping into each other. Another very important school were the guys called the Sophists. And these guys were kind of like the trial lawyers of ancient Greece. They weren't so much worried about what the world was made up of. Instead, they were worried about epistemology, which asks, what is truth and how do we create knowledge? And basically, these guys were philosophers for hire. So if you ever needed a philosopher to argue stuff for you, or if you needed a philosopher to train your son how to argue very well, you would pay the Sophists and they would hang out and teach your kids how to use logic in order to get really good at rhetoric and to become great leaders in the city-state. Basically, they argued that argumentation was the most important thing, because if you could argue well, then you could get your way. And they believed that whoever could argue best actually was in possession of the truth. They said that there's no way of knowing the truth other than argumentation. So whatever you can argue for effectively is the truth. And they famously put it by saying that man is the measure of all things. And they didn't really care about what they were arguing for. They would just teach anybody how to argue for or against anything, just as long as you paid them. So these guys are kind of like philosophers for hire, mercenary philosophers, if you will. And they were pretty unpopular among a lot of people. And now we're moving into the really big names. These guys revolutionized philosophy: Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. They come up with a lot of influential new ideas about metaphysics and epistemology, but they also had an increased focus on ethics. How can we live a good life? And in this way, they're a direct reaction to the sophists. The sophists didn't care about what was right or wrong, they just cared about arguing. Socrates and Plato and Aristotle cared about living a good life, and they thought that was the real purpose of philosophy. So anyway, these guys go on to found major philosophical schools and influence all future philosophers. Socrates is probably the most famous philosopher in the world. He lived through the Peloponnesian War and saw Athens defeated. So like I just said, citizen of Athens, and he was a soldier in the Peloponnesian War. He was concerned with epistemology, but also with ethics. He hated the sophists, who thought that they were basically immoral. And he spent his life educating bright young men for free. So he didn't work for money. He was poor, but he hung out with some of the most important young men in Athens. His basic idea was just asking questions in order to guide them to the truth. So he tried not to ever tell anybody the idea, but rather to ask them questions until they figured it out. He was most interested in asking questions like, what is justice, what is beauty, and what is wisdom? And he believed that most people had no good answers to any of these questions. So he set out to find the answer. But he ends up getting killed. So he wanders around and asks different people in Athens about these questions. What is beauty? What is justice? And whatnot. And these people can't answer him. They can't tell Socrates what's actually going on. So Socrates makes these people look stupid. Also, he goes on to teach young people in Athens to question adults. That basically nobody knows anything, so why should you listen to them? He also notoriously educated the traitor Alcibiades, who sold Athens out to Sparta in the Peloponnesian War. So anyway, these fancy men of the city who have been made look stupid by Socrates eventually accuse Socrates of corrupting the youth, that is, making the youth bad, and taking him to trial. So Socrates doesn't back down, and he doesn't apologize, and because of this, he is sentenced to death by suicide through poison. He's forced to drink a cup of poison. He chooses to drink this poison even though he could escape, because he believes that it is his duty to follow the laws of the city. So even though this seems wrong to a lot of people, Socrates says, no, I'm a citizen of Athens, I have to listen to the laws of the city. All right, so now we've got Plato. So Plato, who you can see there, thinking hard, was a wealthy follower of Socrates. He learned from Socrates. And after Socrates is killed, he decides to devote his life to philosophy. He founds a school called the Academy and trains the next great generation of philosophers. One of Plato's students is this dude, Aristotle. So Aristotle was Plato's best student, but actually disagreed with Plato on just about everything. So he goes on to found his own school called the Lyceum. And Aristotle spent a lot of his life traveling around Greece to study natural phenomena, and in some ways is the world's first scientist. He also ended up as the tutor for Alexander the Great. All right, so there's a big disagreement between Plato and Aristotle. And the big thing they disagree about is, how do we know the world? Plato says every human being is born with a true understanding of the world and just has to realize it, has to remember it. And so he says that basically you can get real understanding of the world just by sitting down and asking careful questions and thinking really hard. So, for example, Plato would just sit down and ask a question like, what is justice? And then keep asking questions and thinking about it until he came up with a definition that he thought was right. So for Plato, a philosopher doesn't really have to do anything except sit and think. Aristotle's different. He's kind of the first scientist, because he says that if we really want to understand anything, we have to wander around and study the world. We can't know anything until we have observed the world. And so after you observe the world, then you use reason to draw conclusions. So for example, Aristotle would say, I've been studying swans for a long time, and every swan I have ever seen is white. Therefore, I can conclude that swans are usually white. So Plato says you just have to think really hard. Aristotle says you actually have to study the world before you can know anything. And you can see a picture there of Plato saying basically all our ideas come from up above, and Aristotle saying, nah man, you got to study the earth. Alright, so one last thing we're going to look at is Plato and Aristotle had different ideas about how we should live and how we should structure society. So Plato lays his ideas out in a book called The Republic, and he basically creates the world's first utopia. And he models this utopia, interestingly, on Sparta, even though he lived in Athens. So in Plato's system, there's social stratification. Commoners live on the bottom, soldiers are in the middle, and the guardians rule at the top. And so he says that basically those are the three most important jobs: workers, fighters, and rulers. And he has the idea that you will do whatever job your parents are, but then you will be moved around based on your ability. So if you're a commoner but you're really strong, you can rise up to become a soldier. Or if you're a soldier who's really smart, you can become a ruler. He argues for total communism. There's zero private property and everything is owned by the city. There's no luxury, and even the guardians live a simple, rough life. Everybody eats the same food and lives in the same kinds of houses and wears the same clothes. Plato believes that education should be different depending on where you live, where you are on the social stratification. He says that commoners and soldiers should basically just be taught to be brave and strong, but not taught to be smart. Basically, he thinks that philosophy is only for the rulers. Anybody else, if they're taught philosophy, will question the whole system and it will mess up the community. And Plato believed in gender equality. He believed that men and women should be taught the same things and play similar roles. He said there would be no such thing as marriage, and that guardians would select people to mate with each other based on health. So the healthiest people would get to have more babies. And also he said that parents would never know their children. Children would be raised in basically public child care centers, and nobody would know who their kids were. That was Plato's idea for the ideal society. Aristotle took a very different approach to how we should live. He didn't worry so much about how society should be set up at large, but rather he worried about how individuals should act. And he basically said if every individual was virtuous, then the world would be good. So he says men should strive to be virtuous. And he says virtue is basically just knowing how to act in any situation. And he says that you can practice virtue, that you can become better at being virtuous over time. So basically, by practicing, you get better and better at virtue. And he uses this idea of the golden mean to explain what virtue is. And he says that every virtuous action lies between two extremes that are not virtuous, that are vices. So, for example, if the question is of bravery, he says that the virtue, courage, lies between cowardice, which is just running away, or rashness, which would be charging ahead even though you're going to be killed by the enemy. He says justice lies between weakness and cruelty. If you are weak and let a criminal off, then you're not being just. But if you're really, really harsh and punish somebody too much, then you're not being just, you're being cruel. So anyway, that's Aristotle's idea. And so basically, rather than worrying about structuring society in one way or another, Aristotle teaches that everybody should just try to be really good in their personal lives and try to be virtuous, and then society would be better. So anyway, that's Greek philosophy, a very short rundown of the main thinkers. And so anyway, just to reiterate, this was the first widespread use of reason rather than tradition or myth to understand the world. It was the beginning of scientific thought, and it led to advances in astronomy, geometry, and logic, and goes on to inspire later scientific thinkers like Galileo and Isaac Newton.